and I would like to welcome Mwalimu Mati to present the report. Mr. Mati is a lawyer and governance expert with a long history in civil society. Among other institutions, he's worked with the Public Law Institute, Transparency International Kenya, where we were colleagues, and he was a founder of the influential Mars Group Kenya. Mwalimu, welcome. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is International Anti-Corruption Day, which was first, celebrated in 2003. Now, at that time, that was the day that they opened the United Nations Convention Against Corruption for signature and ratification. And the very first country to sign and ratify on the same day was Kenya. I remember the Honorable Kiraitu Murungi was the Minister of Justice, and at that time he was with our colleague John Githongo in Merida, Mexico. And Kenya was the first to sign up to the UN Convention Against Corruption. So 21 years later, we seem to have lost some of that desire and that sense of urgency. But haidhuru, the struggle will go on. So thank you very much for coming. This report has been quite a labor, quite intensive labor. But I also thank Gladwell for asking me to participate in this research and publication exercise. So the title of the report is Wrong Direction. This is not just my view or the view of AfriCOG, but if you look at public opinion polling, you will see that when President Ruto took office, he probably had an approval rating. You can see that over time there's been a collapse in the approval rating of President Ruto. As you'll see in the report and in my presentation, his overall support in Kenya was not as high as perhaps he had imagined. And to that extent, I think this report goes out to him to consider that perhaps he did take a wrong turn, which has left us now in this state of a wrong direction. So let us start the report. Tidian. We say that corruption is still rising. Kenya has tried all the prescribed anti-corruption reforms. We've changed our laws. We've created new anti-corruption institutions, the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, for example. We've actually even changed our constitution. But the scale of corruption is actually increasing rather than decreasing. So we find that 19 years ago, actually in this very same hall, the National Commission on Human Rights published a report called Living Large. And that was within the first 18 months of the Kibaki administration. And at that time, it was headline news that the NARC government had spent 900 million shillings on buying new cars. These new cars were bought for the ministers and the highest officials. But how many cars were they? And why was this national news? I mean, today, we would not think that 900 million shillings is a lot of money, because nowadays we're talking in 900 billion shilling scandals. But at that time, the Kibaki government had bought 57 Mercedes-Benzes, some Land Cruisers, Mitsubishi Pajeros, Range Rovers, Nissan Terranos, Nissan Patrols, cars that today you'd probably not find on the government purchase list because they've moved up to Range Rovers, Bentleys, you know what I mean. So we're talking about an irony that despite all this effort and all the money that we've put into fighting corruption, corruption is actually increasing in Kenya. Let's look at the scale of the issue. We're talking about a situation where the former president, Uhuru Kenyatta, famously said that we lose 2 billion shillings a year, 2 billion shillings a day is stolen from government. Now, he wasn't just making that up. The Auditor General's reports show that 20% of government expenditure is actually being stolen or being misapplied, being misappropriated, being paid to the wrong people, being paid for no services rendered at all. Now, 20% of government spending in Kenya shillings terms is 800 billion shillings. 2 billion a day multiplied by that 365 days in every year. Now, 800 billion shillings, this 20% that's going out, that is the one that's been stolen. Then in our government books, the Auditor General says there is 1.6 trillion, that's a third of the national budget, which is not properly accounted for. Corruption has devolved from the counties. Now familiar with the reports of the Controller of Budget expenditure and the scale at which money is being lost. And the net result of all this looting and waste and pilferage is that today, according to Oxfam, 8,000 Kenyans own more than the other 99.5% of the population. In other words, 8,000 Kenyans own more than over 51 million people. That's a highly unequal and a highly dangerous society to live in. It explains the increase in crime. It explains the desperation in which Kenyans are living. And it also explains why we can't as a government, and because we, the people, are the government, provide the basic socioeconomic services that are required under Article 43 of our Constitution. We add on another layer of problems. Because our government doesn't generate enough revenue to finance its ever-expanding budget, because our budget has gone from a Kibaki-era budget of about 700 billion shillings a year to, I think we're now at 4 trillion. Now, this 4 trillion is not, we're not capable of raising that money internally, so we borrow. We borrow domestically and we borrow internationally. Kenyan public debt, foreign and local loans to government, has now hit over 10 trillion shillings. That's more than twice the national annual budget. In each year, therefore, we have to repay interest on these loans, and we have to also pay the principal when it comes due. Now, in 2024, last year we paid over half a trillion, 500 billion shillings out of our revenue, just to service interest. So if between now and 2027 we maintain that same rate of interest payments, we're going to pay over 1.5 trillion shillings. Now, 1.5 trillion shillings is multiple times, it's about 5 times the amount of money that is sent to the counties in each year. If you were to apply it to affecting or improving the health and education and general livelihood of the population, a lot could be done. But because we have a government that makes the wrong choices, this deficit spending, and worse, because we have dishonest government, so that even when you are able to obtain foreign and domestic support, money is going missing, we are trapped in this cycle of borrowing to repay, from Peter to repay Paul. In this administration, there has been a lot of borrowing. Initially, it was said it was borrowing because redemptions for obligations that had been undertaken by the Kenyatta government, for example, had fallen due, and that is true. But the Controller of Budget does say, and this is documented in her reports and in ours, that in this past year alone, Kenya has taken out 36 new foreign loans amounting to just under 900 billion shillings. Almost all of that is commercial. Now, remember we had started out with that figure of 900 million shillings, agitating the public, making them feel that something's got to be done about this monster called corruption. Now we're talking about 900 billion. Gladwell has said it, I have said it, and you, the people, have said it, that 53% of the people polled in 2023 would have said the country is heading in the wrong direction. By September this year, that figure had gone up to 73%. Only 11% in September believed that the country was headed in the right direction. Now that's down from % at the beginning of the Ruto administration. Now that 30% is interesting, and actually it is kind of key, because if you think about it, during the 2022 election, the president was elected with 7.1 million against 6.9 million of Raila Odinga. But both of them, actually, if none of the above had been a candidate, they would have come second and third respectively. The stayaways, the number of people who did not bother to vote, that is, people who did not feel at all motivated to vote for either of those two candidates, was 7.9 million. Ruto would have lost that election by 600,000 votes to none of the above. Now this disengagement from that critical constitutional function, the right to vote, is a cause for worry, but also perhaps it also explains perhaps where the Gen Z, for example, emerges from. Because one of the things that people have always said until recently is that the youth of Kenya are not politically interested. I suppose we will see in 2027 a change in that turnout. But why are people not interested? It's because of, Tijan, poor track records, such as what we have seen over the last 36 months. If you look at that slide, the poor track record. If you look at that slide, and that's just a sketch, nobody has the time to actually document each and every absurd procurement fraud, procurement deal, theft. I've left off that list, for example, the disappearance of 20 metric tons of sugar just vanishing from a government store, where it was being held because it was actually unfit for human consumption, but somehow disappears and then enters the market. And all this with impunity. It's because of this constant barrage of bad news that some people start to feel despondent. But we're here to urge you. This country can be governed better. Now, this country requires citizens to actually object to this kind of track record. To say that this is so far below the par or the standard of leadership that people should not be in office if they preside over these kind of things. So I won't go into those details. They're all documented in the report, but you know them. I mean, it's the Adani leases, the Adani Group's new entry into everything. Got 33 billion shillings missing from just 6 counties, etc. But I want to tell you that the current situation, next slide, is that Kenyans are not even bothering to report corruption. The Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission has an annual budget of 5.5 billion shillings, but it only manages to deliver about 60 cases to court per year. Now, if you divide that 5.5 billion by the 60 files that end up as prosecution files, then we're talking about an investment of in excess of 70 million shillings for each one of those prosecutions, a majority of which do not result in conviction. The EAC reports to the EACC are declining year on year. We're now talking about only 5,000 complaints being made to them, when 5 years ago they used to receive 10,000 complaints a year. Almost a 50% drop. Now, what does that tell you? I mean, it does tell you something. It tells you that people have lost faith in that institution. It's similar to, if you go to the annual National Bureau of Statistics, the overall report, the statistical abstract. I've not referenced it, but if you go there, and you'll find a table which is called Crimes Reported to the Police. Now, the irony of ironies is that the police receive scores, that's something like 20 to 30 complaints of corruption a year. So Kenyans will not report to the EACC and will not report to the police either. Because what's the point? We're talking about a situation where people have understood that state institutions that they fund from their taxes are of no real value to them. It's a waste of time. So I think we need to start holding the EACC to greater account. Ditto, the Director of Public Prosecutions. Because at the end of the day, even if the EACC delivers those 60 cases, they have to be prosecuted by somebody, and that would be the DPP. But in Kenya, corruption is fairly high reward, low risk as an enterprise. Because even if you are convicted, which is highly unlikely, even after conviction, you're most likely to secure bail pending appeal. So you don't need to serve a sentence in Kenya if you're convicted of corruption. The higher up you are in terms of political and social connections, the more likely you will not serve a sentence. The more likely an appeal would be expedited. This is where you see the famous case of John Waluke, the MP for, I think, is it Sirisia? In and out from, how many years was he given? Is it 600 years? I can't remember, but it was a very drastic sentence. I think he was entitled to appeal. But his appeal has been concluded and he has been released and he's back in Parliament. He never spent more than a fortnight behind bars. For a fairly open and shut case. Of course, this might be libelous, and I think I should say no more about that issue. But if you're politically connected, you can even get a presidential pardon. And here you have the case of the late Dr. Davy Koech. Why is this? What is this relationship between political and social connections? And Gladwell, I think, will get into the whole idea of state capture. It's that basically Kenya is structured as a patron and support, or patron and client governance structure. And this has been from the time of the colonialists, where they invented chiefs for communities that didn't have them, and created a client base that they could do business with in colonizing a country. They signed treaties with people who didn't have authority, but once it's on paper, it's almost like a sovereign obligation, and acquired Kenya. Post-independent Kenya is much the same, and all our presidents have played this game. But a patron cannot remain a patron forever unless he rewards his supporters. And not only must he reward his supporters, he must protect them from when they have violated the law. So it's important to ask the question, if you're going to try and analyze the Kenya Kwanza government, for example, what was their support base? A lot of the press has always said that the real support base of Kenya Kwanza was disillusioned youth and rural voters who wanted to punch the dynasties in the nose. And that may be true. But I would say that without money to fight that campaign, because remember it was an insurgent campaign, KK was a brand new, the UDA was a brand new political party. It was in conflict with the state. We were talking about the deep state frustrating its movements. Where did it get the money to fight the state and win? So the real support base of William Ruto are his financiers. And this would explain why some of his policies, in fact, many of his policies, are now seen by the people who voted for him as being almost raids on their pockets. Funders and financiers expect reward. Voters tend to be more passive. They expect you to do your job. But the funder, the moment you put down the Bible, the funder is in with you in that room. Now, at that point, you will then ask, what are the characteristics of this particular president's funders, and are they any different from the funders of previous presidents? And I think Gladwell and AfriCOG have done a very good job of analyzing state capture. So in South Africa, it was an Indian family called the Guptas. In Jomo Kenyatta and Daniel Moi's time, it was something called Tiny Rowland and the Lonro Group, London Rhodesia mining group, which today, by the way, has as its chairman Cyril Ramaphosa. Under Moi, you also had people like Kamlesh Patni appearing, Ketan Somaya, you had the Golden Bird scam. Under Kibaki, you had the Anglo-leasing financiers. All these people had contributed in some way to the political campaigns that had put the governments in power. So if we ask the question of who funded Kenya Kwanza, you'll find that it tends to be contractors. Now these are not just tenderpreneurs, these are just government contractors. They don't own factories per se, but they supply government, so they're importers. Now, people like those, because they don't necessarily have any fixed assets in Kenya that they can't move, will also tend to care less about Kenya than somebody who actually has a manufacturing plant or is a big employer. In some, people like those do not care where the money to pay them comes from. If it's stolen, they won't have a problem with it. They don't fear anti-corruption drives because they know that they are insulated from them. And ultimately, the patron is giving them assurances of protection. Laws can even be changed to give them business advantages. In the report, we reference amendments to the Finance Act in 2023, which created a near monopoly for a key funder of the president in the steel and cement industries. Inside tracks are created so that people will know about government policy before Parliament. So, for example, it's quite clear that the Adanis knew about the new aviation policy before Parliament had even approved that policy. So they put in the PIP document way before the policy had even been approved by Cabinet, but it corresponds in all material aspects to what was stated in the aviation policy, except that they did not have a competition to identify this particular private player. Everything else that they proposed, the 30-year leases, is in the aviation policy. It's even in the advice of the consultants to the Kenya Airports Authority. Without public participation, without parliamentary approval, all these things happen. That is capture of your legislature, capture of your policy by the patrons, key supporters, who I would say are the money men. Now, I don't think I'll go into the detail on the PPP technique, but suffice to say, it is authorized by law, but it is being applied in a partial manner. The design of most of the deals emphasize supposed public gain, but they mask public risks and the costs. And there has been an unnerving tendency, because the PPP would be ideal if the investors were Kenyan. But we have this always looking for an external partner tends to mean that ultimately we're exporting the money that we pay to the jurisdiction or the country from which these companies come from. And finally, there's this unusual but explainable tendency towards secrecy and an outright contempt for public engagement and participation. But all of that, ultimately, is to defeat the purpose of our public procurement laws, which require competition, open competition for government tenders and jobs. Now, the report also has a section which details why the Adani deal did not add up for Kenyans, so that we can lay to rest this canard, this lie, that only people who've never been to the airport would oppose this brilliant deal. Now, I think I said this earlier, but this slide basically references another phenomenon which has resulted in massive pending bills across government. But these are basically, let me correct myself. In the past, it used to be the cause of pending bills. Today, pending bills, where, for example, you've supplied something to a county government and you didn't get paid, so you're put on the book of creditors, is because of inefficiency, or because somebody has actually stolen the money that was supposed to be used to pay you. But in the past, there was a very familiar scam which was perpetrated by construction companies. They're given a contract to do a road. There was one very famous one between Othaya and Nyeri, and you stay on site for a decade, claiming that you've not received some payment, and then you sue the government for the 10 years that your equipment has been lying there, and the government puts in a no contest plea, and then you're paid hundreds of billions of shillings. We have clauses in all these new PPPs that we're talking about, whether it's the Adani Ketraco, which was actually signed, or the Anglo leasing, which basically allow these people to sue us abroad for their purported losses when we cancel their contracts after finding out that they were the proceeds of corruption. So we now have these cowboy contractors. They ride into town, sign a deal with our people issue them with some sort of sovereign guarantee or sovereign letters of comfort. They go and borrow money. They then turn around and sue us when we cancel the contract because it violated our law. There's a similar situation that's going on. I believe it was something to do with some lady, a Kenyan lady, who lives in the United States or in Canada, had been promised a contract to create software to spy on Kenyans. This sounded so bizarre. And she had been promised it, and on the verbal promise by a high-ranking State House official, she says, she then went and hired an American company to create this spyware. And then her contact told her, oh, we've decided against that. So what does she do? She flies into Kenya and files a lawsuit saying that she had been hired, there's no written contract, to do something which is unlawful, and she's in court. And she's suing, and I think she wants 1 billion shillings. And you've got to wonder, when we're entertaining such illegal contracts, even at the point of filing a plaint, but I don't practice law, so probably what I'm saying is actually wrong. But surely there must be some standard before you accept lawsuits against the government. Because that lawsuit is against the government. That is against you and me. It's not against the official or liability will not fall on that official. It will fall on the taxpayers. But reward must be given. That's, I think, what we are saying. It is seen, for example, in the jobs for the boys and girls. This is why there's the insistence, despite multiple court rulings, that we must appoint chief administrative secretaries, 50 of them, when you have 24 ministries. This is because of obligations that are undertaken in the context of political financing, which perhaps President Ruto is actually being a kind of an honest person here. He doesn't want to break these promises. But it's this kind of expenditure that's causing him to be unable to fulfill the campaign promises that he made to the people who really matter, the voters. I think we've described the legitimacy crisis, but the Gen Z uprising is something to be observed, and observed fairly critically. It's not gone away. The complaints that they were making have not been addressed. The political class, despite the fact that the uprising demonstrated how fragile their hold on power can be, seem to have gotten into this comfort zone again. Now, we dropped the hustlers at the first opportunity in preference to political funders. You're now dropping the Gen Z in preference for a broad-based government. The broad-based government ministers are insulting the intelligence of the public. This is dangerous. And finally, in the face of this kind of misconduct, you're willing to use repressive measures against critics, honest critics, in an environment where your tax collections have stalled. Year on year, you're not collecting more taxes, but your budget is increasing. They say that KRA's data shows that revenue has slowed, its growth rate has slowed to its slowest rate in a decade, excluding COVID. Only COVID, that period of the lockdown, was worse than this year, or these past 2 years, economically. And I appreciate that it's possible to look at the data and show growth. But if the growth is basically massive infrastructure projects like the affordable housing, and fine, it's possible that those are employing tens of thousands of Kenyans a year, but so long as your Kenyans don't have money in their pockets, that growth is meaningless. So long as there are no more jobs, that growth is meaningless. You still have legacy wage agreements that must be met to trade unions, but you also have an IMF program which says that you will not raise wages. So in this kind of environment, the patron is constrained on what he can really do, which requires him to change direction. He needs to face the people more than he is facing his financiers and political colleagues. He needs to reduce the conspicuous consumption. How is it possible that in the last 2 years, the National Treasury was actually proposing in this 2024 budget to cut school feeding programs, where you have entries in the budget for renovations of the state houses, the deputy president's residencies. You had provisions for the spouses of presidents, the deputy president, and our friend, the chief cabinet secretary. I think this is absurd. It is absurd. You should respond to Kenyans when they're keeping a track on what kind of shoes and belts and watches you're wearing. You should respond when rumors fly that a governor has been arrested in London with cash in a bank, another minister has been arrested in Dubai with cash in a satchel. You must respond. But it's deafening silence. Instead, we just have hard tackling of critics, media intimidation. In the last year, an order was given to stop adverts with the media. NGOs have been written to and told to align their projects with the manifesto of Kenya Kwanza, which, as I showed you, only got a third of the registered vote. And finally, there was the bizarre allegation that the Ford Foundation was funding anti-government protests over tax increases. The harassment of institutions, the controller of budget, is actually facing criminal charges. Some trumped up accusation that when she was an official of a SACCO, somebody's money got lost. Nothing to do with her, but anything to stop her from revealing that the wage bill of state officers in Kenya is padded. And she only discovered it when she looked at her own office's budget, where she discovered that there was enough money put aside for her salary to pay 2 controllers of budget. You have continuing threats to defund the Auditor General and the courts. You're hearing this from the national government. Now you're even hearing the Nairobi governor saying that the controller of budget, because she points out that he spent 0 on development, they need to do something about her. You know, this is not the right direction. The right direction is to listen to these people who are producing actual statistics and then to respond. You must respond to more than the American prosecutors in New York. The DPP is obviously now back in the control of the executive. The last 2 DPPs, the current incumbent and the past, have dropped. In this report, we've written up a list of about 30 prominent persons who have had corruption cases dropped. Usually, where the EACC is concerned, it is objecting to the withdrawal of these cases. Sometimes, as in the case of a former minister, the court itself says that it's only that you have this authority, but this case doesn't deserve to be dropped. That's the kind of situation we're in. We have parliamentarians and the government trying to reverse regulations that are meant to prevent money laundering. The report documents multiple attempts to raise the cash reporting threshold. You know, if you go to a bank today and you try to withdraw more than the equivalent of $10,000 or 1 million shillings, let's say, you need to state the purpose for this withdrawal. And there surely shouldn't be too much wrong with that, because cash payments are capable of being used in a corrupt way, so it's best if they are recorded. So at least we know that this MP came and took out 50 million shillings because he needed to go to a church Harambee. Why doesn't he just do a wire transfer? So what they're saying, or what they're trying to do, or trying to convince Parliament to do, is to raise this threshold, to triple it, because, you know, you've got an idea. The company's law was changed to require that every company must state the actual owner, because in Kenya we have a lot of proxy directors. But when we were trying to investigate the independent power producer companies before the Energy Committee of Parliament, the registrar of companies himself appears there to say, I cannot tell you who the true owners of these independent power producers are. And you have to ask why. And then Parliament let him leave. That Energy Committee let him leave. There are MPs, and we give two examples, who the President in the State of the Nation address the other day said they have stalled the conflict of interest bill in Parliament. They won't pass it, they won't debate it, they won't give it time. It's not been brought to us for public participation. But there are other MPs in there, opposition MPs and government MPs, who are trying to delete provisions in the anti-corruption laws. One wants to remove the 10-year disqualification, because apparently when you are convicted of a crime of corruption, you're disqualified for 10 years from holding a public office. There's an MP in that house who thinks that's a bad idea. There's another one who wants to make it legal to engage in public procurement without having a budget, because many people are being charged with approving projects which were not budgeted for. And there's an MP in that house who thinks that's a good idea. And finally, in this new environment, and I should go back, and what has the President said about that? He made a joke about the stalled conflict of interest bill, but he knows very well that there are these other two little private members' bills, which could very well pass. But he says nothing about it, not even just to say that he opposes those things. So we have, in the final analysis, many challenges. We have impunity, a patronage network which requires the patron to protect the people that we would ordinarily call corrupt for political considerations. We have institutions that are failing in their duties. And finally, we have new technological challenges. Some of these challenges are arising not out of any state policy, because nobody can complain about mobile money as something that is helping the majority of our people. But the scale of its daily transactions will shock you. I mean, we're talking about trillions of shillings per day. Fairly unregulated. And of course, AfriCOG is so dominant in that business that it's a single point of failure. Nairobi is also becoming a hub of regional criminality. So we have, the continuous wash seizures and it's becoming a money laundering base for corrupt elites from the region. We've got a gambling habit that can also be taken advantage of by international criminals. And of course, we have money transfer platforms. So in sum, I think I just wanted to say that on this International Anti-Corruption Day, we draw the conclusion we're heading in the wrong direction based on a report that will hopefully find favor with you, and we'd urge you to try and, if you agree with its findings or its information, to use it to press and your other leaderships, because something has to change. We can't be 20 years from Merida, when we were the first country to ratify the Convention Against Corruption, and then languish in this perpetual state of domination by a very, very, very corrupt leadership. I thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.